I'm Jamie Reynolds. I work at Lancaster Grammar School, and I've been working with Sunita and Imogen and other people on various little projects, looking at Lancaster's sort of connections with West Indies trade, slavery, and investigating some of the kind of key merchant families. And I know this is a series of other podcasts, so you'll have heard about other families already. Today, I have a small elite crew with me of students. The other Jay Reynolds is in fact Travis. There's Travis. Off screen, we have Alfie and Harry. And there's been a number of other sixth formers who've contributed. I'm not going to list them, but it's just to sort of acknowledge that this isn't just the work that the four of us have done, or indeed Sunita or Imogen. It's actually the sort of product of quite a lot of bits and pieces. Lots of people have contributed along the way. I'm just sharing, I believe I am actually sharing a website with you there. You can see it, Lancaster Slavery Family Trees Community History Projects, catchy title. And that's sort of a repository for the work we've been doing. I'm not going to show you it all now, but I'll show off that I can share a screen and scroll through a website with you. So that's a bit of an introduction, and then we've got some blogs in here. It probably won't load up now, but anyway, if it did, it would load up and show some of our blogs. One of which, yeah, there we go, was from Travis and Bella. So that was, that was probably a year ago now we were doing that, I think. It's a lifetime ago. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Brockbank family today, not with an S. I've been told to make that very clear. And Travis will talk a little bit about the Brockbank. They've not been our main family research, so we haven't sort of got loads to say on that, but we'll say a little bit about the Brockbank family. But the main family that we want to, well, it's mostly, to be honest, about Samuel Gregson Senior, because he's the one really who seems to be sort of most prominent in the areas that we've been researching, so kind of empire and slavery, plantations and so forth. Now what I want to do, but there's a bar at the top that I can't seem to get rid of. I want to share a different screen now. Sorry about this, I'm just going to faff. I'm trying to be too clever here, probably. And what I'd like to do is share this PowerPoint with you. So hopefully you've now got that PowerPoint full screen, the Lancaster, Gregson and Brockbank families. I've just saw something in the chat there, sorry. Yeah, okay, that's not a message I need to read, good. So just to sort of start off with, if you can see the PowerPoint, hopefully you can. We've got a picture of Samuel there, attributed to James Lonsdale. That's in Lancaster Town Hall. I think still, I haven't been down for a while. That's certainly where it was, where I got the image from. And then to sort of talk about the Brockbank, there's Brockbanks Shipyard. That's in the Maritime Museum. And that ship there, which is mentioned in one of the blogs by Travis, is believed to be the Trafalgar, I think it is. I can't remember the tonnage of that, I must admit right now, but I think it was pretty big. One of the biggest ships that they built. So I kind of moved through, and what I've tried to do in response to doing something about Brockbank and Gregson is try and initially weave them together, try and show the links, and then, as I say, Travis will say a little bit about Brockbank, Gregson family tree, and a bit about Mary Brockbank, and then we'll move on. So I've got a little map here. This is actually from 1844, this map, but you can see, hopefully, where it says Lawson's Quay National School, Loon Foundry, the sort of green air, and the Brockbank Shipyard, I believe is where the National School was. You can see that National School, there's an arch or a plaque somewhere that's, I don't know whether it's on the Sainsbury's side of the road, or whether it's outside the fire station. I can't remember because they've done a lot of work there. I don't get out much, so I probably haven't seen where it is at the moment. But that's roughly where we're talking about with the Brockbank Shipyard. And that's also then where the Gregsons, so this was Henry and Samuel Jr. sort of sponsored and helped to found the first public baths in Lancaster. But obviously to sort of curry favour with perhaps the working class who might frequent those baths, keep themselves clean. And there's that image again of the Brockbanks shipyard. And if you can see the key buildings in the background, hopefully, familiar shapes. And then there's the old medieval bridge, if you can see that, which was bought by Brockbank, and then they knocked down one of the arches so they could get the ships through. And I believe you can still see some of the pile foundations when it's low tide, actually. That's what I'm told anyway. So I'm just going to wait there, just stop there before I pass over to Travis. So just to sort of try and look at the links, from the research I've done on Samuel Gregson Senior, there's this link with John Brockbanks. So they're kind of mutually beneficial links. So John invested in Samuel's coal carrying business. That's where I think Samuel gets his initial kind of bit of money from, carrying coal, coastal barges, and then on the canal. And I think also he had a carriage business as well, which is a little bit offshoot. And so Samuel's got that. And then John invests in this. So John Brockbank invests in Samuel's coal carrying business. So there's kind of like investing in that. And in return, then, and also, sorry, John's building barges for Samuel's coal carrying business. So they kind of benefit from a symbiosis of trade. And I like that example. It's kind of intertwining. They invest in each other's companies. Samuel's passing work John's way, then John invests in the canal later on, as would other Brockbanks. And I think I'm correct in saying that both the Brockbanks and the Gregson family with Samuel, they kind of benefit with this so-called golden age, which I think is an interesting term to describe a period where people were trading in slaves and indeed slave-grown materials, but it's a term people use about this. So they grow up through that period as prosperous merchants. We know the Brockbanks built ships for the bilateral trade direct with West Indies, and I think we're pretty certain they do build a number of ships for the trade in slaves as well, and we can see that from the Slave Voyages database. I don't know whether people are familiar with that. That is an excellent resource. And as Brockbanks develop, and as the Gregson family, Gregson Senior in particular, grows more wealthy, becomes manager or secretary of the canal company, and then this sort of link will continue. The canal carries the trade, that spins off back to the Brockbanks. I'm not going to go into huge details. I am conscious of time. And then, as I said, the very manifestation of the shipyard, that shipyard is the same location where the later Gregson, Samuel's sons, would found the baths. So it's a little bit coincidental, that link, I guess, but there you go. So there's some intertwining of these families and relationships. So what I'll do, I think, is now hand over to Travis just to talk about the sort of family tree stuff he's been working on, Mary Brockbank as well, and the Brockbank business in summary. So over to you, Travis. I don't know whether you want that slide up, but it's there.
So I'm going to start firstly with the Brockbanks and then move into how their business relates back to the Gregson project we've been working on. The Brockbanks as a family were very self-sufficient, it seems. The story really starts in 1738 when John and his son George Brockbank found the shipbuilder's yard that was the picture we've just seen on Cable Street in Lancaster. Their business drew in lots of merchants, captains, slave owners, and some big names in Lancaster and across the English trade at the time as well, such as Robert Dobson, John Preston, and Thomas Hind, who was also involved in the last project we did. And I think above all, the company was responsible for the building and launch of more than 100 fairly large ships to the West Indies, and as Sir said, into the Transatlantic slave trade as well, both for slaves and for goods transport. So it seems our town's fortune was reliant in the end not upon slaves as such, but on the valuable commodities that were involved in the slave trade, such as mahogany and cotton. And this is where our investigation into street naming on Lancaster Quay was concerned. But the Brockbanks story sort of continues underneath that trade with the production of components, and this is where the claim that they were self-sufficient sort of comes in. The company was largely at the centre of Lancaster's maritime industry in the late 18th century. George's wife, Mary, who Sir mentioned again, and their children were seamstresses making sails for the ships that Brockbank, or George Brockbank at this time, was building, and other components, namely blocks and rope for the ships, were being put together by smaller providers around town. And this relates also to our Gregson tree. If you look on the slides here, Matthew Gregson, born 1749, and his father Thomas both built blocks, not for the Gregsons, but you know, it's that sort of links to industry again. So in effect, the family had created, you know, on our side of the pond from Liverpool, a sort of local empire for ship production, which in the end fed the larger ports, such as Liverpool. I suppose the same can sort of be said for the Lancaster Gregsons. Whilst not as outright involved in the trade of slaves themselves, the generational involvement across the ages, the 5 generations of the Gregsons that we've been mainly focused on, comes back to that same sort of trade that the Brockbanks were involved with. They were largely consumed by the slave industry and the implications that that had in making money and just being generally involved. That's sort of all I've got to say on the Brockbanks. So I'll now either hand over back to Mr. Reynolds or across to Alfie, I believe.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in again there. Sorry for me, keep jumping in. I'm going to try and get some kind of continuity to it. So thanks, Travis, for that. Sort of gives us another little insight into the Brockbanks. As I said, that's not been our main family research, but we've covered them with the Street Names project, and Travis certainly did with Bella. So kind of that with the family tree up, it begs the question, who is Samuel Gregson? That's our main sort of research figure. So if we look at the family tree, Travis has done a lot of this research. I'm not going to steal this credit from him. We had a bit of trouble finding out exactly who his father was, but in the end we settled on Luke, who was a labourer, seemed to live on Meeting House Lane, we think. And then you can sort of see Samuel Gregson there underneath from Luke, married to Bella Gregson, and then you can see his progeny there. And we've done a little bit on Samuel Gregson Jr., a little bit. I haven't got a lot to say about that today, unfortunately, because Clement, who's done that, isn't with us. I'll mention him, and then Henry Gregson, and also Brian Paget Gregson I'll mention a little bit as well, but only briefly. So that's kind of who he was in very brief overview. And thanks to Michael Winstanley doing some research, a local historian, renowned figure, he's helped piece together a little bit of Samuel's early life. So he's found some records from the Boys' Charity School from about 1770, so entry there. Then he was apprenticed from school to a guy called Henry Tyndall, who was a customs collector. We think that's 1776, what Michael's passed on to us, Mike. And then he appears in the top of a page in 1786, the Port Commission records, as a collector in charge, so kind of like a bookkeeper looking after finances. Excuse me. So his early career is actually based off the port, and that's where he moves up from. And that would have been really good training for his role when he headed the Port Commission, and then later on as secretary for the Canal Company. And found recently, I call it tantalising response to Samuel Gregson Senior. He wrote a letter, I think probably as Port Commissioner, to a committee that Parliament had set up to investigate the abolition of slavery. Because there was obviously Wilberforce and other politicians at the time were pushing Parliament to take this on board. I haven't got the letter he sent. I hope it's somewhere, but I've got the reply. I can read probably half of it, and I'm good at reading handwriting as a teacher, but it seems that he's asking some question about essentially some money that's been allocated to one group. It looks like it might have gone to Liverpool and some group there that are pressuring for basically the blocking of abolition. I'm guessing this, by the way, so this is very much me speculating now. And the committee letter back to him is quite polite, but it kind of says, well, actually, this money's already gone here. And as for your letter about this, and the problem is, I'm just like, well, what was he asking for? I can't work it out. But the very fact that he's writing a letter to a parliamentary committee about the abolition of slavery as a representative of the Port Commission of Lancaster does suggest that he is already a figure who is regionally important and is involved in national affairs. Well, actually, the global affairs, if it's the abolition of slavery. One would expect him to be pressuring the committee to sort of reject abolition. Anyway, I'm going to try and do some more on that. And so through Port Commission 1790s, then becomes secretary of the Canal Company, which Alfie will talk a little bit more about very shortly. And then Brockbanks gets drawn into that with their investments in the Canal Company. And it brings in a whole host of merchant families then. This is where he really starts to stretch his contacts. The Worswicks, who ran a bank, Rawlinsons, Stewarts, Inmans, there's many more. And it's probably through that coal and canal business and linkage that he really does become one of the most prominent, if not at times the most prominent businessman and politician in Lancaster. So that's probably time, I think, looking at it, to hand over to Alfie, who will smoothly replace Travis in front of the microphone, and I will linger on that bit and pass on to Alfie, the most laid-back man in Lancaster. That's what I've heard him referred to as recently by me, to talk about the canal and Samuel's role there. So I'm going to mute my mic. Alfie's going to unmute himself, and I might need to move the PowerPoint, I'm not sure.
Yeah, there we go. So my research was essentially looking at the link between Samuel Gregson Senior and the canal. And the job that Samuel Gregson Senior had, as it says on the PowerPoint, is that he acted as secretary in quite a few documents. He was called an agent. I think in the Westmoreland Gazette, he was named as an active and zealous promoter of the interests of the canal. So already you can see a clear link between him and the Canal Company. Now, the canal, it was finished in 1797. It spanned from Preston to Chewitfield, which I think is around Carnforth. And it passes through Lancaster. Now, the reason that there's such a link to the canal and slavery is when you look into the investment and who invested, you can see that there's a real, almost symbiotic relationship between Lancaster and the canal, being fueled by the slave trade. Is it all right if you just go to the next slide, please, sir? I've got some images here. So, investments-wise, as you can see at the bottom there, the Rawlinsons were probably the most prolific investor into it. They invested about £37,500 into the Canal Company. Alongside that, the Gillows invested £1,000 and the Sathwaites about £5,500. Altogether, that's 44 grand, and adjusted for inflation, apparently, according to a website that I found, it's about £2.5 million in money today. So you can just see the huge amounts of money that are being invested into the canal at the time. Now, the question is, why was there such a push from these businessmen, from these traders, to put money into the canal? And it's because they were getting money back out of it. I think there's 7 mills or 9 mills which were along the canal, and they all dealt with different produce. There was some coconut matting going on. There was some production of cloth with cotton. Obviously, this came from the Americas, but the people like the Gillows, like the Rawlinsons, like the Sathwaites, these are the people who are bringing these produce over, manufacturing it, and then putting money into the canal. Samuel Gregson, who is the main focus of this, he obviously profited from this also, being secretary. And the main point that the whole canal saga is meant to show is that there is no direct link between the Gregsons and the slave trade. He wasn't, between Gregsons and being a slave owner. He didn't actually own any slaves. Quite a lot of his business was also, locally with coal and stuff like that. But he clearly profited from this canal company and from the canal being used by slavers, by people involved with the slave trade. He was making money with imports coming into Glass and Dock and whatnot, being sailed or floated through the canal, and then going to these mills where the produce was then created and then either floated along the canal or sold in Lancaster. And it's just trying to build this image of the canal. Obviously, you can't blame a canal for what it's being used for, but it's seeing this canal as almost like a tool used by these traders, by these businessmen to, use the produce from the Americas, from the produce being produced by people who are slaves, and then seeing how people profit from it, like Samuel Gregson Senior, who again, he wasn't a slave himself, but he clearly had an indirect link and fueled the economy of Lancaster, which was being held up by the slave trade. Pass it over to Sir again.
Yeah, thanks, Alfie. So what we'll do is just quickly now move on. So we kind of looked at the canal domestic industry sector, and Alfie has mentioned expertly the kind of things that were being imported over. Coconut matting, I forgot about that one. That's really interesting. And then what Harry's going to talk about, without further ado, is the kind of overseas aspect of Samuel Gregson's sort of business and political dealings, I suppose. So Harry, I am handing over to you right now.
Yeah, could you move the PowerPoint on, please? There you go. Okay, so in the top left, sorry, you can see that the UCL Legacies of British Slavery database describes him as an apparently unsuccessful counterclaimant with others for the compensation for 106 enslaved people. This led to quite a lot of confusion, I think, for some people. He's listed on a website as a slave owner, but this isn't the case, as our researchers found. The reality is that in 1821, after a financial crash, Samuel Gregson Senior was employed by a bank which was owned by Worswick and Andrade, and he was employed to recover debts on their behalf after they had collapsed in the same year. This is quite a confusing story, so I've got some notes here that I'm somewhat relying on. So after the death of Andrade, a loan the bank had assumed from a man called Richard Hetherington was passed on to Andrade's surviving assignees, who were Samuel Gregson, Thomas Giles, and Thomas Walling Salisbury. So as a result of this, these men made a counterclaim of £1,532 for the compensation of 106 enslaved people on George Hanna's Tortola estate to reclaim money for the bank's investors. They did this because, obviously Hanna owed money to the bank, allowing the assignees a disputed right to claim compensation for the estate. It is important to note that their claim failed, however, due to a judge's ruling that it was illegitimate. So that could be argued to be sort of chance, sort of wheeler-dealer-esque thing by Samuel Gregson to, make a quick buck on behalf of the bank. And this isn't the only time that this has happened. You can see in the bottom left that the Tortola claim was not the end of Samuel Gregson's involvement in the international slave trade. So, the source in the bottom left is a newspaper advert for the sale of a coffee plantation in Port Royal, Jamaica, which included 145 male and 140 female slaves, which was sold at auction. The advertisement for this coffee plantation references that for further particulars, Samuel Gregson, Thomas Giles, and John Charnley should be consulted. There's a gap of 7 years between the first claim that Samuel was involved in and the second, which makes it unlikely that they were both related to the bank. So this sort of muddies the water as far as Samuel Gregson's involvement in the international slave trade goes, because while he didn't directly trade slaves, he was necessarily, he was profiteering off a sort of side hustle, you could call it, I suppose, style involvement in the slave trade. So I suppose in conclusion, you could say that, he's definitely not. It's definitely not black and white what you could say about him. You know, he's not definitely good or definitely bad. He's sort of in a sort of grey area in the middle where I think a lot of people might lie in this period. So yeah, I'll hand back to Mr. Reynolds now.
Brilliant. Thanks, Harry. Thanks, Alfie and Travis, for kind of keeping to the script, and then I kind of come along and waffle and ruin it all. Hopefully people have got a sense then of the kind of multiplicity of his interests. There's so much more, and there's me thinking I wouldn't even manage 20 minutes on this, and I'm gone way over, so I apologise. But to me, he is such a fascinating figure because he isn't, as far as we're aware, directly a slave owner or a slave trader. I think that's why I'm fascinated by him. Many as the evening I've kind of been searching. I remember Imogen was doing this one night as well. We were looking for the Blue Mountain coffee plantation, pinging messages. I found it. And then we managed to get, I can't remember what, we got an historian with an expertise in plantation, I think Imogen did, and we managed to kind of get evidence of where this sort of the mountain coffee plantation actually was. But yeah, we still don't really know what Gregson was sort of all about there. And I think some of it, from what I'm looking at, seems to be his link as mayor, sort of somebody who was obviously trying to put forward the political interests and economic interests of the town. So he's mayor in 1817 and 1825. And he's also really influential in stabilising Lancaster's banking sector, because there's a crash. The Worswick Bank crashes in, I think it's 1822, and then there's the Dilworth, Arthington and Burkitt Bank, which also crashes a few years afterwards. And the combined amount is something like $500,000 or 600,000 in then, which is about the amount of money that was invested in the canal company, actually. It's a similar figure. So it makes sense if Samuel comes and steps in with his wheeler-dealer side hustles, as Harry describes it as. I'm getting an image of like Del Boy here from Only Fools and Horses, but I don't know whether that's fair. And then he sort of tries to get some of this money back, I think, for the banks. I think that's what he's trying to do, and for the investors, because they want paying back some of these people. And that's, you know, however or why he's got involved in this, I think it's a brilliant illustration of what they're all about. His sons go on to further the dynasty. I suppose it lasts for 2 generations, really. You've got Henry, who becomes MP and mayor as well. You've got Samuel Jr., who we need to do more on him, but seems to be a director on the East India Company board in part of his career, local MP. And I think via junior and senior, they reorient Lancaster away from the West Indies trade to the East Indies trade. That seems to happen in the 1820s. And I don't think that's an accident. I think, in my mind, Samuel Gregson Sr. is there with his sons, pushing them in directions. Henry kind of in one direction, solicitor, mill owner. Brian Paget, another son, runs the canal company after him. Is prominent in getting the railway to Lancaster, and that's a whole other story I haven't had time to look at yet. So winding it all up, these 2 families who we've talked about and others have talked about, they're all interwoven. They're kind of inevitably. There's a little slide. I don't know whether it's a much bigger diagram I was making, but I was trying to illustrate how all this is linked. And at the centre of it, I genuinely think Samuel Gregson Sr. is really integral to what's going on in Lancaster in the late 18th and early 19th century. I think he's right at the hub of it. And whilst he may not have got his hands dirty directly in slavery, I really don't think it's that much different in accepting vast amounts of money as secretary of the canal company, in investing in all kinds of other bits and pieces in this. And the Brockbanks are, it's shipbuilding, but they're doing the same. They do invest in direct trade with the West Indies. They invest in ships that they build. Gregson may have invested in a ship called the Venus, but I need more corroboration for that. And that again seems to be direct trade with the West Indies. So in conclusion, Samuel Gregson's like not involved in the slave trade, but his hands are kind of still all over it, because of the investments that he has. And I think that probably is a time while I'll wind up this planned bit of the talk slightly over time. And if anybody's got any questions or however else this last bit works for the next sort of maybe 15 minutes, because I'm conscious I've got these guys probably got lessons, and I'm interviewing students straight after this as part of their induction to the sixth form, because that's where we're at the moment in the first 2 weeks. So thanks for putting up with us and listening to our crazy interwoven story. I suppose I don't know. I might have to. I don't know whether I'm kind of in charge, I guess now, honestly. So I can see there's Christopher Donaldson there. He's got a picture of a batter, baseball player. Maybe had your hand up. Hi, Christopher. I don't know whether you've got a question.
Oh, hello. Yes, sorry about that. Yeah. Sorry, I think I was taking notes while you were all speaking, and I wasn't muted at part, so I do apologize.
Right.
I was just applauding. I didn't have a specific question, but just wanted to thank you all for your presentations and really impressive fruits of your research that you're sharing with us today. So it's a real pleasure to listen in. That's all.
That's very kind. We didn't put you to sleep, so I'll take that as 1 point for us, a victory. I don't know if there are any questions, by the way, that is not a problem at all. We will go away and scurry on with our day jobs. But as I said, if there is, please just shoot away. I'll give it a minute, and then got all three of them together there in the top corner now, haven't we? It isn't my screen anyway. The tremendous trio. Right, I'm going to kind of assume that means we've done a brilliant presentation. We've covered every base. Nobody's got any questions because we were so precise and accurate. And I'll probably finish it there. If that's all right. I don't know whether anybody else wants to jump in, but if I'm in charge, I don't know. Maybe I should finish it off. Sunita, are you going to rescue me from my waffle?
I just wanted to say, I hope everyone who's been listening has a sense of what Alfie and Harris and Mr. Reynolds and Travis has been trying to help us to understand, that absolutely no one who was involved at that level in Lancaster in the 18th and 19th centuries could have said that they weren't in some ways associated with the fruits of transatlantic slavery. So what we need to kind of increasingly talk about is not the direct connections with transatlantic slavery, but how the indirect connections of investments, of economic growth, not just in Lancaster, but the hinterland, the area and the region, are fueled by all the spoils of that have come from on the back of transatlantic slavery, and helping people to understand that that legacy is equally important, and not just the direct legacy. I don't know whether anybody would like to kind of talk about it, or share any thoughts that they have about it. Imogen, over to you.
Over to me. That was really great. Thanks so much. And it'd be fascinating to have a follow-up when we've done more work on the connection to the East Indies of Samuel Gregson Jr., I think, as well. But yeah, that entanglement, those connections between Lancaster and all these different global locations and places through slave trade, plantation slavery, imperialism, colonialism is really important work. And this is original research that's contributing to rethinking Lancaster and its place as in empire and colonial history. So I think it's brilliant work. Well done. Nice to see you all.